The curse of the Babylonian king Nabonidus. You stand in the shadow of ancient Babylon, where the ziggurat rises like a mountain built by mortal hands, and the air tastes of dust older than memory. The year is 556 BC, and the empire trembles beneath the weight of a king who speaks to gods that no longer answer. Nabonidus sits alone in his chamber, surrounded by tablets covered in cuneiform script so ancient that even the oldest priests struggle to decipher them. He is 63 years old, his beard streaked with silver, his eyes burning with an obsession that has consumed him for the past decade. While his son Belshazzar rules in Babylon, attending to the tedious business of governance and war, Nabonidus pursues something far more dangerous, the worship of forgotten things. The curse begins not with words spoken in anger, but with silence. The priests of Marduk, Babylon's supreme deity, watch as their king dismantles centuries of tradition. Nabonidus has turned his back on the New Year festival, that sacred celebration when the king must take the hand of Marduk's statue and renew his divine right to rule. Without this ritual, the cosmic order itself grows unstable. The priests whisper in darkened temple corridors, their voices carrying the weight of prophecy and threat. But Nabonidus doesn't care. He has found something older than Marduk, older than Babylon itself. In the desert city of Tema, nearly 500 miles from his capital, he has discovered temples to Sin, the moon god worshipped by his mother's people. Sin, whose crescent symbol adorned the crowns of kings when Babylon was nothing but mud huts along the Euphrates. Sin, who ruled the night sky when the world was young. The archaeological tablets you've studied tell a story stranger than fiction. For 10 years, from 553 to 543 BC, Nabonidus abandoned Babylon entirely. He left his son to manage an empire while he lived in self-imposed exile in Tema, building temples to a god his people had forgotten, making sacrifices according to rituals so ancient that no living soul could verify their correctness. Imagine the madness of it. The most powerful man in Mesopotamia, ruler of the Neo-Babylonian Empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, choosing to live in a remote desert oasis, surrounded by Aramaic-speaking traders and nomads, while his capital city buzzed with rumors of his insanity. The curse, when it finally crystallized into words, came from the mouth of Adad-Guppi, the high priestess of Sin in Haran. She was 104 years old when she died, and with her final breath, she placed a binding upon her son. Nabonidus had honored her above all others, had restored her temple, had elevated Sin to supremacy over Marduk himself. But Adad-Guppi knew what her son did not. Some gods demand too high a price for their favor. You have opened doors that were sealed for good reason, she whispered as death approached. You have given power to that which should sleep. The moon remembers what men forget, and it is not kind to those who disturb its dreams. 3 days after his mother's death, Nabonidus experienced the first vision. He stood in the courtyard of his palace in Tema when the moon rose, full and swollen, larger than it had any right to be. In its face, he saw not the familiar patterns of light and shadow, but something else. Ruins of cities that had never existed, towers that scraped the stars, civilizations that had risen and fallen in cycles so vast that human history was but a single heartbeat in an endless rhythm. The vision should have terrified him. Instead, it filled him with a hunger that bordered on religious ecstasy. Here was proof that his instincts had been correct, that the old gods possessed knowledge the new ones had abandoned. He redoubled his efforts, pouring the wealth of Babylon into excavations across the desert, seeking older temples, older tablets, older truths. His scribes recorded everything, dutiful even in their private horror. They wrote of how the king spent entire nights staring at the moon, speaking in languages no one recognized. They documented the appearance of his dreams, which he insisted be preserved in cuneiform. Visions of a world before the flood, and the Anunnaki walked among men and taught them secrets that corrupted as much as they enlightened. Back in Babylon, Belshazzar struggled to maintain order. The priests of Marduk grew increasingly bold in their opposition, questioning the legitimacy of a king who refused to perform the sacred duties. Foreign ambassadors reported that Nabonidus had lost his mind, that the empire was vulnerable, that perhaps the time had come for new management. But Nabonidus barely noticed. He had found something in a collapsed temple 30 miles west of Tama, a sealed chamber containing tablets that predated even the first Sumerian dynasties. The script was proto-cuneiform, so primitive that it existed at the very edge of writing and pictography. And what it described made his blood sing with terrible understanding. The tablets spoke of the moon not as a god, but as a prison. They described how the earliest ancestors had trapped something within the lunar sphere, something that existed before time and matter, something that had threatened to unmake reality itself. The ritual of imprisonment had required the sacrifice of an entire generation, the binding of their souls into the moon's fabric to serve as eternal guardians. But rituals decay, seals weaken, and someone who knew the right prayers, who made the right offerings, who possessed the right royal bloodline, could begin to undo the ancient working. Nabonidus realized with crystalline clarity that his entire life had been preparation for this moment. His mother's obsessive devotion to sin, his own archaeological passion, his seemingly irrational abandonment of Babylon, all of it had been guided by forces he was only beginning to comprehend. He was not mad. He was chosen. The priests would call what happened next a curse, but Nabonidus understood it as transformation. He began the counter ritual on the night of the lunar eclipse in the year 547 BC. 40 priests assisted him, all sworn to secrecy. All promised knowledge and power beyond imagining. They worked through the night as the shadow consumed the moon, chanting words that hurt the throat to speak, making offerings that would have horrified even the most bloodthirsty of Babylon's traditional rites. And when the eclipse reached totality, when the moon hung in the sky like a wound in the heavens, something answered. The presence that touched Nabonidus's mind was vast and cold and utterly inhuman. It had been conscious before the sun ignited, had witnessed the birth of galaxies, had existed in states of being for which human language possessed no vocabulary, and it had been imprisoned for so long that its anger had evolved into something worse. Curiosity about what these mayfly creatures might do if properly motivated. Nabonidus collapsed, blood streaming from his nose and ears. When he woke 3 days later, he was changed. His eyes, witnesses reported, had developed a silver sheen that caught the moonlight in unnatural ways. He spoke with 2 voices simultaneously, his own and something that resonated with frequencies that made listeners nauseous, and he began to issue proclamations that even his most loyal followers found disturbing. He declared that Babylon would be rebuilt according to ancient specifications, that certain gates must be sealed and others opened, that the ziggurat must be reoriented to align with celestial configurations that hadn't occurred since the dawn of human civilization. The work began immediately, and the city's residents watched in growing horror as their familiar streets were demolished and reconstructed according to a plan that seemed to shift and change with the phases of the moon. The curse, as the priests named it, spread beyond Nabonidus himself. Workers on the reconstruction projects began experiencing shared dreams, visions of cyclopean cities beneath the desert sand, of libraries containing the sum knowledge of civilizations that had preceded humanity. Some went mad, tearing at their flesh and screaming about the weight of the sky. Others simply disappeared, walking into the desert at night and never returning. Belshazzar, ruling from the palace in Babylon, received increasingly desperate reports. His father had become something other than human, was pursuing goals that no longer made sense in mortal terms. The priests demanded action, threatening open rebellion if the king's madness wasn't contained. But how do you contain a curse that has already taken root? How do you stop a transformation that operates according to laws older than the gods themselves? The answer, when it came, arrived from Persia. Cyrus the Great, king of Anshan in Persia, had been watching Babylon's internal chaos with the patient interest of a predator observing wounded prey. In 539 BC, 17 years after Nabonidus had first travelled to Taima, Cyrus made his move. The Persian army approached Babylon, and the city's defenders discovered that their walls, reconstructed according to Nabonidus's visions, had been built with fatal flaws. Gates that should have been impregnable opened at the lightest touch. Towers positioned for maximum defensive coverage instead created blind spots where entire battalions could hide. It was as if the city itself had been redesigned to facilitate conquest rather than prevent it. Nabonidus stood atop the ziggurat as the Persian forces entered Babylon without resistance, and he laughed. The sound echoed across the city, carrying harmonics that made birds fall from the sky and sent dogs howling, because he finally understood the fullness of the curse, the terrible joke that the entity in the moon had played upon him. He had not been freeing an imprisoned god. He had been preparing a cage. The entity needed a physical anchor, a place of power aligned to specific cosmic frequencies, maintained by human devotion and watered with human suffering. Babylon, rebuilt according to ancient specifications, had become that anchor. And Nabonidus, last king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, had served his purpose perfectly. As Cyrus's soldiers climbed the ziggurat steps, Nabonidus felt the presence withdraw from his mind. It left behind memories of eons, knowledge that spanned galaxies, and the crushing realization that he had been nothing but a tool, wielded by something that viewed entire civilizations as components in mechanisms too vast to comprehend. The historical record states that Cyrus treated Nabonidus with unexpected mercy, allowing the deposed king to live out his remaining days as governor of Carmania, a remote Persian province. But the tablets you've never seen, the ones kept in private collections and buried archives, tell a different story. They describe how Nabonidus lived for another 37 years, aging but never dying, his body sustained by the residual energies of his contact with the lunar entity. He spent those decades writing, producing thousands of tablets that documented everything he had learned, everything he had done, everything that had been done through him. His warnings were explicit and desperate. The entity was now anchored to Babylon, would remain so as long as the city stood, and would slowly extend its influence across the surrounding region. It fed on human consciousness, particularly on dreams and madness, growing stronger with each passing year. Eventually, it would accumulate enough power to break free of its lunar prison entirely, and when that happened, reality itself would begin to unravel. The solution, Nabonidus wrote, was simple in concept, but devastating in execution. Babylon must be destroyed so completely that not one brick remained upon another, so thoroughly that even its location became uncertain, so absolutely that future generations would debate whether it had ever existed at all. But who could accomplish such a task? Cyrus certainly wouldn't. Babylon was now the jewel of the Persian Empire, a center of learning and commerce. Its destruction would be economic suicide. So Nabonidus did something that demonstrated both the depth of his corruption and the desperate sincerity of his repentance. He began to work a final ritual, one that would take centuries to complete, that would require the participation of forces and peoples who didn't yet exist. He started by encoding instructions in multiple forms, astronomical calculations hidden in apparently mundane economic tablets, architectural plans disguised as hymns to gods long forgotten, prophecies embedded in folk tales and children's songs. Each piece was incomplete in itself, but together they formed a map, a set of instructions for how to properly destroy Babylon and sever its connection to the lunar entity. The curse he placed upon himself was one of memory. He arranged that his name would be remembered, but always in fragments, always incomplete, always slightly wrong. Future archaeologists would find references to the mad king who worshipped the moon, but the specifics would remain frustratingly unclear. His 10-year absence from Babylon would be documented but never fully explained. His motivations would be debated, his actions questioned, his very existence sometimes doubted. This fragmentation was intentional. Nabonidus understood that the entity could influence human consciousness, could nudge researchers toward or away from certain conclusions. By making himself a historical puzzle, he ensured that each generation would approach his story fresh, would ask new questions, would potentially stumble upon the hidden warnings he had scattered across millennia. He died in 502 BC, at the age of 117, in a small house in Carmania. His last words, recorded by a Persian scribe who didn't understand their significance, were, "The moon remembers, but the moon can be made to forget. When Babylon is dust and its location is myth, the anchor will fail. May my name be the thread that leads them there." For centuries, Babylon thrived. Alexander the Great planned to make it his capital before his death in 323 BC. The Seleucids maintained it as a major city, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, the city began to fade. Floods damaged buildings that were never quite fully repaired. Trade routes shifted to favor other locations. Political power concentrated elsewhere. By the 1st century AD, Babylon was largely abandoned. By the 2nd century, its exact location was becoming uncertain. By the 5th century, it existed only in legend and fragmentary historical accounts. The entity's influence didn't end with Babylon's fall, but it weakened considerably. Cut off from its primary anchor, it could only affect the world through dreams and the occasional susceptible individual. It whispered through the ages, seeking new servants, new tools, new ways to strengthen its connection to Earth. You would recognize some of its victims. scholars who developed sudden obsessions with lunar symbolism, archaeologists who went mad excavating Mesopotamian sites, astronomers who reported seeing structures on the moon's surface that no telescope could verify. Each represented an attempt by the entity to re-establish what Nabonidus had built for it. Each ultimately failed. In the 19th century, European archaeologists began systematic excavations of Babylon's remains. They found wonders: the Ishtar Gate, the foundations of the ziggurat, countless tablets documenting daily life in one of history's greatest cities. But they also found things they couldn't explain, chambers that seemed to exist in impossible geometries, tablets whose cuneiform shifted when viewed at different times of the lunar cycle, recurring dreams among the excavation teams, of a voice that spoke in frequencies below the range of human hearing. Most dismissed these phenomena as the effects of heat, isolation, and overactive imaginations. A few took them more seriously, began researching Nabonidus specifically, started to piece together the fragmentary warnings he had left behind. In 1914, a German archaeologist named Franz Weber claimed to have decoded a series of tablets that revealed the truth about Nabonidus's lunar worship. He presented his findings to the Berlin Academy of Sciences in a lecture that lasted 6 hours, during which several attendees reported feeling nauseous and experiencing visual distortions. Weber's notes were confiscated afterward, ostensibly for further study, and he was quietly committed to a psychiatric institution where he died 3 years later, still insisting that the moon was watching. The tablets Weber had decoded disappeared from the Academy's archives. No official record of their content exists, but copies were made, passed through private channels, eventually landing in collections scattered across Europe and America. You could read them yourself if you knew where to look and were willing to accept the consequences of that knowledge. They describe how the entity has been systematically influencing human development, pushing civilization in directions that would eventually lead to new anchors, new ways of binding it to physical reality. The development of radio technology, for instance, with its ability to broadcast thoughts and images across vast distances, creating networks of consciousness that mirror the structure of its imprisoned awareness. The space race, which put human artifacts on the moon itself, establishing physical connections that could potentially be exploited. According to Weber's interpretation, every lunar landing, every probe that impacts the moon's surface, every plan to establish permanent bases there, represents another thread being woven, another potential anchor being forged. The entity is patient. It has waited this long. It can wait longer. The curse of Nabonidus, then, isn't just his personal tragedy, or even Babylon's fall. It's the ongoing influence of a consciousness so alien and vast that it views human history as a single coherent moment, a brief flicker in which it might find escape from its lunar prison. You might wonder if any of this is true, if it's not just the paranoid fantasies of troubled minds seeking patterns in randomness. But consider this: every human culture has moon myths, stories of lunar madness, warnings about gazing too long at the full moon. Every civilization that has studied the moon seriously has produced a subset of researchers who developed obsessions that destroyed them. And Nabonidus, that forgotten king who worshipped a forgotten god, remains an historical enigma whose story can never quite be told completely. The current archaeological consensus is that Nabonidus was a well-meaning but politically inept ruler who alienated the Babylonian priesthood through his religious reforms, and facilitated Cyrus's conquest through his incompetence. This narrative is neat, contained, reasonable. It requires no recourse to supernatural explanations or conspiratorial thinking, but it also fails to account for the specifics. Why 10 years in Taima exactly? Why the particular reforms he implemented? Why the astronomical calculations found in his tablets align with lunar cycles that won't repeat for another 16,000 years? These questions remain open, and the answers that emerge are never quite satisfying, never quite complete. Perhaps that's precisely how Nabonidus intended it. By making himself a mystery, he ensured that people would keep investigating, would keep asking questions, would potentially stumble upon the warnings he embedded in his story. Each researcher who studies him, each new interpretation of his reign, represents another chance for someone to understand the danger and take appropriate action. What that action might be in the 21st century is unclear. You can't destroy Babylon more thoroughly than time has already accomplished. You can't make the moon forget what it remembers. But you can choose not to look, not to listen, not to respond when the lunar entity whispers through dreams and madness, seeking new servants, new anchors, new ways to manifest in the waking world. The curse continues, waiting for those foolish or curious enough to pursue it. Nabonidus' name survives in fragments, his story told incompletely, his warnings hidden in plain sight within historical records that scholars study without truly understanding. And above it all, the moon watches, patient and eternal, home to a presence that remembers when the world was young and dreams of the day when it might be so again. This is the forgotten curse, not a single moment of cosmic vengeance, but an ongoing process, a slow unraveling that began in 556 BC and continues into the present. Nabonidus was both its victim and its enabler, both the warned and the warning, both the mad king who doomed Babylon and the desperate prophet who tried to prevent greater catastrophe. When you look at the moon tonight, remember him. Remember that some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed again. Remember that the price of forbidden knowledge is not paid all at once, but in installments across generations. Remember that curses, like the truths they contain, can be forgotten, but never truly erased. The moon remembers even when we don't, and it is not kind to those who disturb its dreams. The forgotten phantom king of Angkor. The jungle had swallowed the truth whole, and for 700 years, nobody thought to ask what it was choking on. You stand in the archives of the École Française d'Extrême-Orient in Siem Reap, holding a palm leaf manuscript that shouldn't exist. The edges crumble at your touch, releasing the smell of centuries, earth and incense and something else, something like burned sugar. The script is Old Khmer, the kind used in the 12th century, but the carbon dating says 1300, a gap of 100 years, an impossible gap. The manuscript mentions a name that appears nowhere else in the historical record. Tribhuvanad Dyavarman, the Sun King of 3 worlds, a phantom. The official histories of Angkor are precise, almost obsessively so. They tell you that after the death of King Jayavarman VII in approximately 1220, the empire entered a period of decline. They tell you about his successors. Indravarman II, Jayavarman VIII, the gradual conversion to Theravada Buddhism, the slow fade of Angkorian glory. They tell you everything except this, that between 1221 and 1223, someone ruled who was systematically erased from every stone inscription, every royal chronicle, every temple wall. Someone the jungle remembers, even if history doesn't. The first clue came from the trees. A French botanist named Claudine Mercier was studying the growth rings of dipterocarp trees in the Angkor Archaeological Park when she noticed something odd. Several ancient specimens showed a pattern of accelerated growth during a 2-year period in the early 13th century, followed by sudden stress markers. Trees don't lie about climate. Something had changed in those years. A shift in water management, perhaps, or a dramatic alteration in the forest canopy. The irrigation systems told a similar story. Ground-penetrating radar revealed modifications to the Beret reservoirs that didn't match any known construction phase. Someone had re-engineered the hydraulic network of Angkor with extraordinary sophistication, then abandoned the work halfway through. The modifications used techniques that wouldn't appear in Khmer engineering for another 50 years. You trace the phantom through absence, through the spaces between documented reigns, through the archaeological shadows. The Chinese diplomat Zhou Daguan visited Angkor in 1296 and described the customs of the Khmer court in meticulous detail, but he also mentioned something curious. The monks he spoke with referred to a period they called the Silent Years, a time when the temples fell quiet and the royal ceremonies ceased. They wouldn't explain further. Some silences, they said, were mandatory. The stone inscriptions are where the erasure becomes visible. At Ta Prohm, you find a dedication stele from 1222 that's been partially recarved. The original text is still legible beneath the new layer if you know how to look. It speaks of a king who brought the waters to speak and made the stones remember their purpose. But then, chisel marks. Someone had taken great care to obliterate specific passages while leaving the rest intact. You take rubbings, photograph the angles of light across the damaged surfaces, and slowly, impossibly, a name emerges from the stone's memory. Tribhuvanadityavarman, the Sun King of 3 worlds, his reign left physical marks that couldn't be completely erased. At Preah Khan, hidden behind a later addition, you discover a small shrine with astronomical alignments that match no other structure in Angkor. The calculations are breathtaking in their precision. Someone had understood the precession of the equinoxes, had mapped the stars with mathematical accuracy that rivaled anything being done in Song Dynasty China. The shrine was built to capture sunlight on one specific day of the year, the 3rd of February, 1222. You check the Chinese astronomical records. On that date, a total solar eclipse passed directly over Angkor. The path of totality would have turned day to night for exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds. A Sun King who brought darkness at noon. The symbolism is almost too perfect. The Vietnamese annals provide an unexpected fragment. In 1222, they record a diplomatic mission to Angkor that returned in confusion. The embassy had been received by a king who wasn't the expected successor to Jayavarman VII. This king spoke in riddles, they reported, and had covered the palace mirrors with silk. He asked the Vietnamese envoys whether a reflection could rule a kingdom, and whether shadows had more substance than the things that cast them. The envoys concluded he was mad and terminated negotiations. But perhaps he wasn't mad. Perhaps he was asking a more profound question about the nature of power and legitimacy. You find his face in the least likely place, a minor temple called Krol Ko. dedicated to Jayavarman VII's royal guru. Tucked into a decorative panel, almost invisible unless you're looking for it, is a portrait carving unlike any other at Angkor. The style is wrong for the period, too naturalistic, too psychologically penetrating. The face belongs to a young man, perhaps 30 years old, with eyes that seem to look through stone rather than at the viewer, and there, in the tiny inscription beneath, the name again, Tribhuvanadityavarman. The few fragments of his story that survive suggest someone extraordinary. He appeared at court in 1220, claiming to be the son of Jayavarman VII by a concubine who had lived in the temple of Preah Khan. No one could verify the claim, but no one could disprove it either. He demonstrated knowledge of royal ritual that only someone raised in the palace could possess. He spoke 5 languages fluently, including Chinese and Cham. He could recite the entire Ramayana from memory, and he had ideas about how to save the empire. By 1220, Angkor was already in trouble, though the official inscriptions maintain the fiction of eternal glory. The hydraulic system that had sustained the city for 400 years was failing. Deforestation had destabilized the watersheds, the barais were silting up, the climate was shifting toward drought. The empire needed innovation, needed someone willing to break with tradition. Tribhuvanadityavarman proposed a radical restructuring of the water management system, based on principles he claimed to have learned from treatises brought from India. He wanted to implement a network of smaller, distributed reservoirs rather than relying on the massive royal barais. He wanted to introduce new rice cultivation techniques, new crops, new patterns of settlement. He wanted to reform the corvée labor system that was bleeding the countryside dry. The conservative faction at court was horrified. These proposals threatened the entire cosmological order that Angkorian kingship represented. The barais weren't just irrigation systems. They were replicas of the cosmic ocean. The temples weren't just monuments. They were the axis mundi, connecting earth to heaven. You couldn't simply reorganize them for efficiency. But Jayavarman VII was dying, and in his final months, he made a decision that would haunt the empire. He named Tribhuvanadityavarman as regent, giving him authority to implement his reforms on a trial basis. For 2 years, the Phantom King would have the chance to prove his vision. The archaeological record of those 2 years is thin but tantalizing. Construction began on 17 new reservoirs in a ring around Angkor. New canal systems were dug following principles of gradient and flow that were genuinely innovative. Agricultural experimental stations appeared in the countryside, testing drought-resistant crop varieties. The labourers conscripted for these projects were treated differently, paid in rice and cloth, rather than simply compelled, housed in better conditions, given days of rest. For a brief moment, it seemed to work. The rice harvests of 1221 were the best in a generation. The new reservoirs held water through the dry season. The experimental crops proved viable. Tribhuvanadityavarman's reforms were succeeding, and that was precisely the problem. The Brahmin priests, who legitimized royal power through their mastery of Sanskrit ritual, found themselves sidelined. The great families who controlled the temple estates saw their influence waning. The generals who had built careers on conquest watched resources redirected to irrigation and agriculture. The Phantom King had accumulated too many enemies too quickly, and he had failed to understand the most important rule of Angkorian politics. Power wasn't about effectiveness, it was about performance. When Jayavarman VII finally died in late 1221, the conservative faction moved quickly. They installed Indravarman II, a royal cousin who represented continuity and tradition. Tribhuvanadityavarman refused to cede power. He claimed that Jayavarman had recognized him as a true son in a deathbed declaration. He argued that his reforms were succeeding and deserved more time. He made the fatal mistake of believing that results mattered more than legitimacy. The civil war that followed lasted less than 6 months, but it was vicious enough to scar the empire permanently. Tribhuvanadityavarman held Angkor Thom itself, along with several major temples. Indravarman controlled the countryside and the loyalty of most provincial governors. The conflict wasn't fought with massive armies. The empire was already too depleted for that. Instead, it was a war of sieges and skirmishes, of water supplies cut off and food stores blockaded, of temples fortified and populations starved. In May of 1222, during the eclipse he had calculated so precisely, Tribhuvanadityavarman attempted a final gambit. He staged an elaborate ceremony at the Bayon, claiming that the darkened sun proved his divine mandate. If the gods had not favoured him, he proclaimed, they would not have written his legitimacy across the sky. For 4 minutes and 17 seconds, the world turned dark in the middle of the day. In that darkness, he declared himself sole legitimate king. It was a magnificent piece of theatre, but it changed nothing. Indravarman's forces breached Angkor Thom's defences 2 weeks later, and Tribhuvanadityavarman vanished into the jungle with a handful of loyal followers. What happened next is the strangest part of the story. Most failed pretenders to the Khmer throne were executed publicly, their deaths inscribed on temple walls as warnings. But there's no record of Tribhuvanadityavarman's death, no triumphant inscription celebrating his defeat, no description of his punishment. Instead, there's a systematic erasure that required time, effort, and coordination. Every inscription bearing his name was recarved. Every temple dedication was modified. Every official document was destroyed or amended. The new reservoirs he had built were attributed to earlier kings or left anonymous. His reforms were quietly maintained. They worked too well to abandon, but credit for them vanished into the administrative record. It was as if the empire had decided that the Phantom King was more dangerous as a martyr than as a forgotten footnote. By erasing him completely, they denied him even the dignity of defeat. But erasure is never complete. The jungle keeps its own records. In 1223, a small temple was constructed deep in the forest, far from Angkor's administrative centre. It's called Bantai Chmar, though that's not its original name. The structure is modest by Angkorian standards, but the inscriptions are peculiar. They speak of a king who walked among the stones like a shadow, and whose name was Silence. They describe someone who had rejected worldly power to seek a different kind of sovereignty, the sovereignty of understanding, of seeing the empire's problems with clarity, even if he couldn't solve them. Some scholars think Tribhuvanadityavarman lived out his days at this temple, protected by monks who still believed in his vision. Others suggest he died in the jungle during the rainy season of 1223, just another casualty of the Civil War's aftermath. The Vietnamese annals mention rumours of a Khmer prince living in exile in Champa, teaching astronomy and hydraulic engineering, but they never name him. You prefer to think he survived, at least for a while. The evidence is circumstantial. a pattern of temple construction in remote areas over the next decade that uses his innovative techniques, a series of inscriptions that seem to quote his ideas without attribution, the spread of his agricultural reforms despite official silence about their origin. It's as if his vision outlived his political existence, propagating itself through the empire like seeds scattered on the wind. The supreme irony is that many of Tribhuvanadityavarman's reforms became standard practice within a generation. The distributed reservoir system he proposed was gradually implemented. The agricultural innovations were adopted. The labor practices were modified in the direction he had advocated. The empire absorbed his ideas even as it erased his name, like a body rejecting a transplanted organ while somehow integrating its function. By the time Zhou de Guan visited Angkor in 1296, the silent years had become a kind of parable. The monks told him that there had once been a king who tried to change too much too quickly, who had forgotten that empires move like trees rather than like water. Fast growth, they said, produces weak wood. The forest knows to grow slowly, to add each ring patiently, to respect the wisdom of gradual change. But you wonder if they were right. Standing in the ruins of Angkor now, with the jungle reclaiming the stones and the berets turned to swamps, you can't help but think that perhaps Tribhuvanadityavarman's great failure was also his greatest insight. He understood that the empire was dying, that the old cosmological certainties couldn't sustain a civilization facing climate change and resource depletion. He tried to adapt, to innovate, to imagine a different kind of Khmer greatness. And for that vision, he was erased. The palm leaf manuscript you're holding contains what might be his only surviving words, written in his own hand or copied by someone who knew him. The script is elegant, the reasoning clear. He writes about water as if it were a living teacher, about rice as if it contained the secrets of governance, about the relationship between rulers and ruled as a kind of mutual responsibility rather than cosmic hierarchy. It's radical stuff for the 13th century, ideas that wouldn't become common for another 500 years. On the final page, there's a statement that might be his epitaph. A king who cannot be forgotten has failed, for he has made himself more important than his kingdom. Better to be the rain that falls in darkness, unnamed but necessary, than the sun that burns so bright it leaves only desert behind. The phantom king of Angkor understood something that the official histories still haven't grasped. Greatness isn't always written in stone. Sometimes it's written in the patterns of water flowing through carefully engineered channels, in rice growing in drought-resistant varieties, in the small daily miracles of a system that works even after everyone's forgotten who designed it. You carefully return the manuscript to its climate-controlled case, aware that you're handling something that maybe a dozen people have read in 700 years. Outside, the sun is setting over the ruins of the Bayon, turning the stone faces gold and crimson. In this light, you can almost see him, a young man standing at the center of the world, calculating eclipses and water flow, trying to save an empire that didn't want to be saved. The jungle has swallowed most of the evidence, but here and there, if you know where to look, the Phantom King still haunts the stones. His reservoirs still hold water in the right season. His canal systems still follow the contours of the land with elegant efficiency. His ideas still whisper through the archives, anonymous but persistent. History remembers the kings who built the tallest temples, who conquered the most territory, who inscribed their names largest on the surviving stones. But the jungle remembers something else. It remembers the king who understood that water matters more than monuments, that systems outlast personalities, that the greatest power might be the power to disappear while leaving the world slightly better than you found it. Trifuvanaditya Varman, the Sun King of 3 worlds, the Phantom King of Angkor, he ruled for 2 years and has been forgotten for 700. But his vision remains, encoded in the landscape like a message written in a language the stones are still learning to read. And perhaps that's the only kind of immortality worth having. Not to be remembered, but to have mattered. Not to echo through the ages, but to change them in ways too subtle for history to notice. The eclipse he calculated so carefully passed into darkness and returned to light, as all eclipses do. But the shadow it cast is still there, if you know how to see it, still there in the water flowing through channels he designed, in the rice growing in fields his reforms made possible, in the slow, patient work of trying to imagine a better world even when the world isn't ready to listen. That's the story the jungle tells in the language of roots and stone and water. The story of the king who was never there, whose reign was a dream the empire tried to forget, whose greatest achievement was to disappear so completely that his ideas could survive without him. The forgotten Phantom King of Angkor, whose absence speaks louder than any inscription. The lost King of Scotland. The wind howled across the highlands like a banshee's wail, carrying with it the scent of heather and the whispers of forgotten battles. In the year 1746, the world knew of Bonnie Prince Charlie and the doomed Jacobite rising, but few remembered the name that had been deliberately erased from Scottish history. King Malcolm IV, known to those who still spoke of him in hushed tones as Malcolm the Forgotten. His story began not in the grand halls of Edinburgh or Stirling, but in a crumbling monastery perched on the edge of Loch Ness, where the water churned dark and mysterious beneath granite cliffs. It was there, in the summer of 1153, that a young monk named Brother Aldwin discovered a cache of documents hidden beneath the flagstones of the chapel floor. The parchments were ancient even then, their edges brittle with age, their words written in a mixture of Latin and Gaelic that required weeks of careful translation. What Brother Aldwin uncovered would change everything he thought he knew about Scottish history. The documents spoke of a king who had ruled for barely 3 years in the mid-11th century, a monarch whose reign had been so thoroughly obliterated from the records that even the chroniclers of later generations had no knowledge of his existence. This was Malcolm, son of Duncan I, elder brother to the man history would remember as Malcolm III, called Canmore, the great chief. The true Malcolm, the elder son, had been chosen as king in the year 1057, following the death of Macbeth at the Battle of Lumphanan. He was 23 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with hair the colour of autumn wheat and eyes that held the depth of the northern seas. Unlike his younger brother, who had spent years in exile at the English court, Malcolm had been raised among the Highland clans, learning their ways, speaking their tongue, understanding the ancient customs that bound the people to the land. His coronation took place on the hill of Scone, where Scottish kings had been crowned since time immemorial. The stone of destiny sat beneath him as the assembled nobles placed the crown upon his head, and for a moment It seemed that Scotland had found a king who could unite the fractured kingdom, heal the wounds left by decades of warfare, and restore the old ways that were slowly being forgotten. But Malcolm IV's vision for Scotland differed dramatically from what the powerful southern lords desired. While they looked to England and the growing Norman influence, Malcolm turned his gaze to the ancient Celtic traditions, to the laws of tanistry and the communal ownership of land that had governed his people for generations. He refused to grant vast estates to Norman knights, rejected the feudal system that was transforming England, and insisted that Scottish law and custom should remain supreme in Scottish lands. Within months of his coronation, the conspiracies began. The southern lords, many of whom had married into Norman families or held lands on both sides of the border, saw Malcolm's policies as dangerously backward, a rejection of the progress and civilization that the Norman influence promised. They whispered in dark corners about the young king's stubbornness, his preference for Highland counsel over their own wisdom, his determination to preserve a way of life they believed was destined for extinction. The leader of this faction was Thorfinn Sigurdsson, Earl of Orkney, a man of mixed Norse and Scottish blood who controlled vast territories in the north. Thorfinn had supported Macbeth's claim to the throne and had only grudgingly accepted the return of Duncan's line. He saw in young Malcolm not a king, but an obstacle to his own ambitions. Joining him were several powerful southern lords, Gospatric, who held lands in Northumbria, Siward's sons, who remembered their father's campaigns in Scotland, and most significantly, Malcolm's own younger brother, the prince who history would later crown as Malcolm III. The younger Malcolm, barely 18 years old, but already hardened by his years in England, had absorbed the Norman worldview completely. He had seen the great stone castles rising across England, witnessed the efficiency of Norman administration, and understood the power that came from adopting these new methods. Where his brothers saw the preservation of Scottish identity, the younger Malcolm saw opportunity and advancement. The conspiracy took shape over many months, conducted in whispered conversations and sealed letters carried by trusted messengers. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. They would not merely depose King Malcolm IV, they would erase him entirely. His reign would be stricken from the records, his name removed from the list of Scottish kings, his very existence denied by future generations. It would be as if he had never ruled at all, as if the crown had passed directly from Duncan I to Malcolm III, with nothing but Macbeth's usurpation in between. In the early spring of 1060, the trap was sprung. King Malcolm was invited to a gathering of the northern lords at Inverness, ostensibly to discuss matters of defence against Norse raiders. He travelled with a small retinue of loyal men, never suspecting that he rode toward betrayal. On the third night of his stay, as he slept in a chamber of Inverness Castle, armed men burst through the door. The fight was brief but fierce. Malcolm's personal guard died defending him, their blood staining the stone floor. The king himself killed 2 attackers before being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. But they did not kill him. That was crucial to the plan. A dead king could become a martyr, a rallying point for rebellion. Instead, they needed him to disappear, to vanish so completely that doubt would cloud any future claims of his existence. Bound in chains and gagged to silence his protests, Malcolm was smuggled out of Inverness Castle before dawn. A body, some nameless man of similar build, was dressed in the king's nightclothes, and left dead in his chamber, his face so mutilated by sword strokes that identification would be impossible. The official story spread quickly. The king had been murdered by unknown assassins, likely Norse raiders or supporters of Macbeth's line seeking revenge. The younger Malcolm, displaying appropriate grief and righteous anger, was crowned within a fortnight. His first acts as king were telling. He granted extensive lands to Norman knights, established feudal obligations throughout the southern lowlands, and began the transformation of Scotland into a kingdom that resembled its southern neighbour. The old Celtic laws were gradually suppressed, replaced by Norman legal codes. The ancient system of tanistry, where kings were chosen by merit rather than strict primogeniture, was abandoned in favour of direct inheritance. And what of the true Malcolm, the forgotten king? He was taken in darkness to a remote monastery on the Isle of Skye, a place so isolated that few even knew of its existence. There, in a stone cell overlooking the churning waters of the Minch, he would spend the remainder of his days, forbidden from speaking his true name, watched constantly by guards who ensured he could never escape or make contact with the outside world. The monks who tended him were sworn to secrecy under pain of excommunication and death. They knew him only as Brother Columba, a nobleman who had taken holy orders after some unnamed transgression. Malcolm IV, rightful king of Scotland, disappeared into the mists of obscurity, while his brother wore the crown and shaped the kingdom according to his Norman-influenced vision. Yet the conspirators had underestimated the loyalty of some of Malcolm's followers. A handful of Highland chiefs who had supported the true king suspected foul play. They could not believe that assassins had struck so precisely, killing Malcolm while leaving his brother conveniently alive and ready to assume power. These men began their own quiet investigation, sending trusted agents to gather information, piece together rumors, follow the faint trails that the conspirators had tried so hard to erase. It took 3 years, but eventually they found him. A fisherman from the Isle of Skye, travelling to the mainland to sell his catch, mentioned to a contact in Fort William that the monastery on the western coast of the island housed a mysterious prisoner, a man who bore himself like nobility despite his monk's robes, who sometimes wept while staring across the water toward the mainland, who had eyes the colour of the northern seas. The loyal chiefs convened in secret, meeting in a hidden glen where their ancestors had gathered before battles in ages past. They debated long into the night about what should be done. Some argued for immediate action, gather their forces, rescue their true king, march on Edinburgh and expose the usurper. Others counselled caution, pointing out that Malcolm III was now firmly established on the throne, supported by powerful Norman allies, commanding armies that far outnumbered anything the Highland chiefs could muster. In the end, wisdom prevailed over passion. They decided to send a single man to the monastery, someone who could verify the prisoner's identity, and, if he was indeed their lost king, offer him hope that he had not been entirely forgotten. The man chosen for this dangerous mission was Cormac MacLeod, a warrior in his 40th year who had served in Malcolm IV's personal guard and had miraculously survived the massacre at Inverness by being absent that night on another errand. Cormac travelled to Skye in the guise of a pilgrim seeking spiritual guidance. The monastery accepted him without suspicion. They received few visitors, but turned none away who came in genuine faith. For 2 weeks, Cormac lived among the monks, participating in their prayers and labours, carefully observing everyone he encountered, searching for the man he had once sworn to protect with his life. He found him in the monastery garden, tending to herbs with hands that had once wielded a sword with deadly skill. The years had aged Malcolm. He was now 26, but looked older, his hair touched with premature grey, his face lined with sorrow and resignation. Yet Cormac knew him instantly, would have known him anywhere. Those distinctive eyes that could belong to no other. Their meeting had to be carefully orchestrated. Cormac waited until the afternoon prayers, when most of the monks gathered in the chapel, leaving only a few brothers working in the gardens and outbuildings. He approached Malcolm while the deposed king knelt among the rosemary and thyme, his hands dark with soil, his monk's robe dusty from his labours. "Brother Columba," Cormac said quietly, using the name the monks knew, "might I seek your counsel on a spiritual matter?" Malcolm looked up, and for a heartbeat, recognition flashed across his features. But years of captivity had taught him caution. He rose slowly, brushing dirt from his hands, his expression carefully neutral. "Of course, my son, walk with me, and we shall talk." They moved deeper into the garden, away from the monastery buildings, toward a low stone wall that overlooked the sea. Only when they were certain no one could overhear did Cormac speak again, this time in the Gaelic tongue, rather than the Latin the monks preferred. "My lord," he said simply, "your people have not forgotten you." Malcolm closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they glistened with tears he refused to let fall. "Cormac," he whispered, "you survived Inverness. Thank God. I had feared all my loyal men perished that night." "Most did, sire, but a handful of us escaped, and we have been searching for you these 3 years past. The Highland chiefs know of your imprisonment. They would raise armies to free you if you but give the word." For a long moment, Malcolm said nothing, staring out across the water toward the mainland, toward the kingdom that should have been his. The wind pulled at his robes, carrying the salt scent of the sea and the distant cries of seabirds. "No," he said finally, his voice heavy with resignation. "Too much blood has already been spilled in Scotland's name. If the chiefs rise up now, my brother will crush them utterly. The Norman armies will devastate the Highlands. The people will suffer for my sake, and I cannot bear that burden." "But you are the rightful king," Cormac protested. "Malcolm III sits on a throne built on treachery and lies. History must know the truth." "History," Malcolm said bitterly, "is written by those who hold power, not by those who hold the right. My brother has already succeeded in erasing me from the chronicles. To future generations, I will be nothing more than a footnote, if I am remembered at all. Perhaps that is for the best." "How can you say such a thing? You fought for Scotland, for the old ways, for everything our people hold sacred." Malcolm turned from the sea to face his former guard, and Cormac was struck by the change in him. This was no longer the fierce young king who had defied the Norman lords, but a man who had been broken by years of isolation and helplessness, worn down by the knowledge that his sacrifice had changed nothing. "The old ways are dying, Cormac. Perhaps they were always doomed. My brother understands what I was too proud to see. Scotland cannot stand alone against the tide of change sweeping across these islands. The Norman influence will transform us, whether we wish it or not. By resisting, I might have doomed our people to perpetual warfare and poverty." At least my brother's path offers stability, even if it means surrendering much of what made us uniquely Scottish. Then you will remain here, accept this imprisonment without protest. What choice do I have? If I escape, if I reveal myself, I doom countless others to death in a war they cannot win. Better that I remain Brother Columba, a forgotten man in a forgotten place, and let Scotland move forward without me. Cormac felt his heart break for his king, seeing the defeat in his eyes, the weight of abandonment and loss that bowed his shoulders. The chiefs asked me to tell you something, sire. They said that even if you cannot be restored to your throne, even if the world never knows your name, they will preserve your memory. They will pass down the truth from father to son, from generation to generation, so that somewhere in some hidden corners of the Highlands, people will always know that once there was a king who fought for them, who chose exile over compromise, who sacrificed everything rather than betray the old ways. For the first time since their conversation began, Malcolm smiled, a sad, weary smile, but genuine nonetheless. That is worth more than any crown, old friend. Tell them I accept their gift gratefully. Tell them to care for our people, to preserve what they can of our traditions, to remember that being Scottish means more than simply occupying this land. It means carrying forward the values and customs that our ancestors died to protect. They spoke for another hour, sharing news and memories. Two men bound by loyalty and loss, standing at the edge of the world while history moved on without them. When Cormac finally departed the monastery, he carried with him not the vengeful declaration of a deposed king demanding restoration, but rather a message of acceptance and hope, that even in defeat, even in obscurity, Malcolm had found a kind of peace. The Highland chiefs received Cormac's report with mixed emotions. Some raged against Malcolm's decision, arguing that he had no right to deny his people the chance to fight for him. Others understood his wisdom, recognizing that pragmatism sometimes required painful sacrifices. In the end, they honored his wishes. There would be no rebellion, no attempt to rescue him from his island prison, no public revelation of his survival. Instead, they began the long work of preservation, in hidden glens and remote valleys, and whispered stories told by firelight. The true history of Malcolm IV lived on. Bards composed ballads about the lost king, though they were careful never to sing them where spies for Malcolm III might hear. Scribes copied the few documents that proved his existence, hiding them in secret locations where future generations might one day discover them. Brother Aldwin's discovery in 1153 was one fruit of this careful preservation. The documents he found had been hidden there by one of Malcolm's loyal followers, tucked away in the hope that someday someone would find them and learn the truth. The monk spent the last years of his life carefully translating and copying these precious parchments, creating multiple versions that he distributed to trusted contacts throughout Scotland. But the effort to preserve Malcolm's memory faced constant opposition. Malcolm III and his successors worked tirelessly to erase any trace of the forgotten king. Monasteries were searched, suspicious documents were burned. Anyone caught speaking of a Malcolm who had ruled before Malcolm Canmore faced severe punishment. The official history was clear. Duncan I had been succeeded by the usurper Macbeth, who was eventually defeated by Malcolm III. There was no room in this narrative for another Malcolm. No space for a king who had inconveniently embodied values that the new Scotland was leaving behind. On the Isle of Skye, Brother Columba continued his quiet existence. The years passed slowly, marked by the changing seasons and the eternal rhythm of monastic life. He rose before dawn for prayers, worked in the gardens, studied scripture, and maintained his silence about his true identity. The monks who guarded him grew old and were replaced by younger men who knew nothing of the monastery's secret prisoner, who simply saw another brother devoted to a life of prayer and contemplation. Malcolm aged along with his jailers and fellow monks. The grey in his hair spread until it was entirely silver. His hands, once so strong and skilled with weapons, became gnarled with arthritis from years of manual labour. His eyes, those distinctive northern sea eyes that had once burned with passion for his kingdom, grew dim with cataracts. He became an old man long before his years should have made him so, worn down by isolation and the weight of dreams abandoned. He died in the winter of 1093, 33 years after his deposition, having outlived his usurping brother by 2 years. He was 56 years old, but looked 20 years older. The monks buried him in their cemetery with all the proper rites, marking his grave with a simple stone that bore the name Brother Columba and the dates of his entry into the monastery and his death. No mention was made of his royal blood, his rightful claim to the throne, or the kingdom he had lost. The abbot who presided over the funeral was one of the few remaining monks who knew the truth about Brother Columba's identity. As he scattered holy water over the grave, he whispered a prayer that the official liturgy did not include. Rest now, Malcolm IV, King of Scotland. You fought for your people and lost, but you are not forgotten. Your sacrifice was not in vain, and your memory will endure long after the stones of castles have crumbled to dust. The centuries rolled forward, and Scotland transformed beyond anything Malcolm would have recognised. The Norman influence his brother had welcomed reshaped the kingdom completely. Great stone castles rose across the land, replacing the old hill forts. The feudal system took root, creating a rigid hierarchy of nobles and vassals. The Celtic laws and customs that Malcolm had fought to preserve were gradually suppressed, surviving only in the most remote corners of the Highlands. Yet the memory of the lost king persisted in those hidden corners. In the 18th century, when Bonnie Prince Charlie raised his standard and called the clans to fight for the Stuart cause, old men told their grandsons about another prince, another king, who had been betrayed and forgotten. The parallel was not lost on them. Both men had represented a vision of Scotland that modernity seemed determined to destroy. Both had been defeated not by superior force alone, but by the inevitable march of historical change. After the final defeat of the Jacobites at Culloden in 1746, when the British government set about systematically destroying Highland culture, burning clan tartans, banning bagpipes, and forcing the people to abandon their traditional ways of life, a few elderly Highlanders made secret pilgrimages to the Isle of Skye. They sought out the old monastery, which had long since fallen into ruins, and searched among the tumbled stones and overgrown graves for any trace of the king their ancestors had served. Most found nothing. The centuries had erased names from weathered headstones, and the monks who had known the truth were 600 years dead. But one searcher, a man named Angus MacLeod, who claimed descent from Cormac himself, discovered something remarkable. Beneath a collapsed section of the monastery wall, protected by the fallen stones, was a small stone box. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow survived the centuries, were 3 parchment pages covered in faded but still legible writing. The documents were in a mixture of Latin and Gaelic, written in different hands, apparently compiled by several authors. They told the story of Malcolm IV, his brief reign, his betrayal, his imprisonment, and his death. They named the conspirators, described the plot in detail, and preserved testimony from witnesses who had seen the deposed king alive, years after he was supposed to have died. Most remarkably, they included a physical description of Malcolm that matched perfectly the few contemporary accounts that had survived, leaving little doubt about the document's authenticity. Angus MacLeod understood immediately what he had found. These pages were proof, fragile, ancient, but undeniable proof that the lost king had existed, that he had been deliberately erased from history, that the official chronicles of Scotland had been falsified to hide an inconvenient truth. He carefully rewrapped the documents and carried them home, where he made meticulous copies before hiding the originals in a new location, learning from history's lesson that precious things should never exist in only one place. He shared the discovery with a small circle of trusted friends, men who still valued the old Highland ways despite the laws forbidding such sentiments. They discussed what should be done with this evidence. Should they publish it? Expose the historical lie? Demand that Malcolm IV be restored to his rightful place in the Chronicle of Scottish Kings? Or would such a revelation simply invite the authorities to confiscate and destroy these precious documents, silencing the lost king's voice forever? In the end, caution prevailed once again. Scotland in the mid-18th century was a dangerous place for those who clung to old traditions and challenged official narratives. The documents were copied several more times, with the copies distributed to various hiding places throughout the Highlands. The originals were sealed in a metal box and buried in a secret location known only to Angus MacLeod and his eldest son. The story might have ended there, with Malcolm IV remaining a whispered legend, a ghost story told by Highland fireplaces, believed by some but dismissed by most as romantic folklore. But history has a way of refusing to stay buried, and the Lost King was not quite ready to be forgotten. In the late 19th century, during the Victorian period's romantic fascination with Celtic history, a scholar named Dr. James Sinclair began researching anomalies in the Scottish chronicles. He noticed small inconsistencies in the dating of events during Malcolm III's early reign, gaps in the narrative that didn't quite make sense, references in Irish and Welsh documents to Scottish events that the official Scottish histories never mentioned. Being a meticulous researcher, he began compiling these discrepancies, trying to understand what they might indicate. His investigation led him to the Highlands, where he collected oral histories from elderly residents of remote communities. Time and again, he encountered variations of the same story: a king before Malcolm Canmore, a betrayal, an imprisonment, a deliberate erasure. The details varied, and Dr. Sinclair knew that oral tradition could be unreliable, prone to embellishment and confusion. But the consistency of the core narrative, appearing in communities that had little contact with one another, suggested that these stories might have a common root in actual historical events. Dr. Sinclair's research culminated in a scholarly paper published in 1887, titled The Lost King Hypothesis: Evidence for an Erased Reign in 11th Century Scotland. The paper was cautious in its claims. presenting the evidence without making definitive statements, acknowledging the difficulties of proving events that powerful forces had worked hard to obscure. Nevertheless, it created a minor sensation in academic circles, inspiring other scholars to investigate the mystery of Malcolm IV. The truth, when it finally emerged into the light of accepted history, came not from academic research, but from an accident of fate. In 1942, during the Second World War, German bombers targeting industrial sites in Scotland dropped their payload on what they believed to be a factory, but was actually an ancient manor house being used as military storage. The explosion destroyed the building, but also cracked open a sealed chamber in its foundation, a room that had been locked and forgotten for centuries. Among the debris, soldiers found a collection of documents that had survived by pure chance, protected by the manor's thick stone walls, even as the building above them collapsed. These papers, when examined by historians, proved to be a cache of correspondence between Malcolm III and his fellow conspirators, dating from the years 1058 through 1062. The letters discussed the plot against the elder Malcolm in shocking detail, including explicit acknowledgement that they planned not just to depose him, but to erase him from history entirely. The discovery made headlines throughout Britain. Here was proof, written in the conspirators' own hands, that a king named Malcolm had indeed ruled Scotland before Malcolm III, and that his reign had been deliberately suppressed. Academic historians rushed to re-examine the chronicles, looking for other evidence that might have been overlooked or misinterpreted. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to reconstruct the true story of Malcolm IV, corroborating the oral traditions that Highland communities had preserved for nearly 900 years. Today, Malcolm IV is recognised by historians as a legitimate king of Scotland, though many details of his reign remain obscure. His name has been added to the official list of Scottish monarchs, and scholars continue to uncover new evidence about his brief time on the throne. Yet for all the academic recognition, he remains the lost king, a figure more legendary than historical, a symbol of the paths not taken and the dreams that died before they could be fulfilled. In the Highlands, where his memory was kept alive through centuries of suppression, the vindication of Malcolm's existence brought a measure of satisfaction to the descendants of those who had never forgotten him. The old stories were true after all. There had been a king who fought for the old ways, who chose exile over compromise, who was betrayed and erased, but whose memory survived through sheer stubborn loyalty. The monastery on Skye, where Malcolm spent his final years, is now a protected historical site. Archaeologists have excavated the ruins, finding among the remains a grave that might be his, though definitive identification is impossible after so many centuries. A simple monument stands there now, bearing an inscription that attempts to summarize a complex life in a few brief words. Here lies Malcolm IV, King of Scotland, who ruled from 1057 to 1060. He fought for his people and lost, but he was not forgotten. The Lost King's story resonates across the centuries because it speaks to fundamental human experiences. The pain of betrayal, the weight of impossible choices, the courage required to accept defeat with dignity. Malcolm IV could have condemned his people to endless warfare in defense of his crown. Instead, he chose obscurity and isolation, allowing history to move forward without him, preserving peace at the cost of his own legacy. In that choice, perhaps, lies his true greatness, not in the battles he might have won or the reforms he might have implemented, but in his willingness to surrender everything when he understood that fighting would bring only suffering to those he had sworn to protect. The forgotten king became, in the end, the sacrificial king, offering himself so that others might live. His name may have been erased from the chronicles for centuries, his reign reduced to a footnote in academic texts, but the lost King of Scotland achieved a kind of immortality that no amount of suppression could destroy. He lives on in the stories still told by Highland firesides, in the scholarly debates about Scotland's medieval history, in the hearts of all who understand that sometimes the greatest courage lies not in fighting to the end, but in knowing when to let go. And somewhere, in hidden places throughout Scotland, the documents that Angus MacLeod copied so carefully still exist, waiting to be discovered by future generations. The lost king's voice continues to echo through the centuries, a reminder that history is never quite as simple as it seems, that truth has a way of surviving even the most determined attempts to bury it, and that the forgotten are often the ones most worth remembering. The sealed tomb of Emperor Qin. The summer heat pressed down on the yellow earth of Shanxi province like a heavy blanket, turning the air thick and difficult to breathe. In the fields outside the modern city of Xi'an, farmers had worked this land for generations, their ploughs cutting through soil that held secrets deeper than any living person could imagine. It was 1974, and the world was about to rediscover something that had been deliberately forgotten, buried beneath layers of earth and centuries of silence. Young Jifa wiped the sweat from his brow and drove his shovel deeper into the ground. He and his brothers were digging a well, as their ancestors had done countless times before. The drought had been merciless that year, and the commune needed water desperately. The shovel struck something hard, and Yang assumed it was just another rock in this stubborn earth. But when he cleared away the dirt, he found himself staring at something that made his heart race, with a mixture of fear and wonder. A face made of terracotta, staring back at him from the darkness of 2,000 years. He didn't know it then, but Yang had stumbled upon the edge of the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century. More importantly, he had found the key to understanding why Emperor Qin Shi Huang's actual tomb, the sealed mound that rose like a small mountain just over a kilometer away, had remained untouched, deliberately avoided, and carefully forgotten by generation after generation of Chinese people who knew exactly where it was, but refused to disturb it. The terracotta warriors that Yang and his brothers discovered that day were not the tomb itself. They were guardians, an army of 8,000 soldiers, 130 chariots, and 670 horses, all rendered in clay with such precision that each face was unique, each expression different. These warriors stood in battle formation in massive underground pits, facing east toward the lands Qin Shi Huang had conquered, eternally vigilant against enemies who might threaten their emperor even in death. But the warriors were merely the outermost ring of protection. The actual tomb of Emperor Qin, the first emperor who had unified China in 221 BC, lay untouched beneath a massive earthen pyramid that locals had always called Mount Li. For more than 2 millennia, this artificial mountain had dominated the landscape, and yet the tomb beneath it remained sealed, its secrets intact, its interior preserved exactly as it had been when the emperor was laid to rest in 210 BC. The question that haunted archaeologists, historians, and treasure hunters alike was simple yet profound. Why had such an obviously important site never been looted? Why had grave robbers, who'd violated virtually every other imperial tomb in Chinese history, left this one alone? And why did the Chinese government, even after discovering the terracotta warriors, refuse to excavate the tomb itself? The answer lay buried not just in earth, but in history, legend, and fear. To understand the tomb, one must first understand the man who built it. Yingzheng became king of Qin at the age of 13 in 246 BC, inheriting a kingdom that was already powerful, but still just one among 7 warring states that had torn China apart for centuries. The boy king was intelligent, ruthless, and possessed by a vision that would have seemed impossible to anyone else. He would unite all of China under his rule, ending the centuries of warfare and creating a single unified empire. It took him 25 years, but Yingzheng accomplished what no one before him had managed. Through a combination of military conquest, diplomatic manipulation, and sheer force of will, he defeated the other 6 kingdoms one by one. In 221 BC, at the age of 38, he declared himself Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of Qin, and China as a unified nation was born. But unification was just the beginning of his ambitions. Qin Shi Huang standardized everything he could touch: the writing system, currency, weights and measures, even the width of cart axles, so that all vehicles would fit in the same road ruts. He connected and extended various defensive walls to create what would eventually become the Great Wall of China, stretching thousands of kilometers across the northern frontier. He built a network of roads and canals that would facilitate trade and military movement for centuries to come. Yet for all his accomplishments in life, Qin Shi Huang was obsessed with death. More specifically, he was obsessed with avoiding it. The emperor surrounded himself with alchemists and magicians who promised to discover the elixir of immortality. He sent expeditions across the seas to find the mythical islands of the immortals. He consumed mercury pills that his advisors swore would extend his life, never realizing that the mercury was actually poisoning him, slowly killing him, even as he desperately sought to live forever. When it became clear that physical immortality might elude him, Qin Shi Huang turned his attention to ensuring that his power and status would continue into the afterlife. He began construction of his tomb when he first became king of Qin at age 13, and the project continued throughout his entire reign, a period of 36 years in total. At its peak, 700,000 workers labored on the tomb complex, which covered nearly 60 square kilometers. The tomb was designed to be more than a burial place. According to the ancient historian Sima Qian, writing about a century after Qin's death, the tomb was a recreation of the emperor's realm in miniature. The ceiling was decorated with pearls representing the stars and constellations. The floor contained a detailed map of the empire, with rivers of mercury flowing through channels representing the Yangtze and Yellow rivers, mechanically circulated to simulate their actual flow. The entire chamber was designed to be a universe unto itself, with the emperor at its center, ruling for eternity as he had ruled in life. But Sima Qian's account also included details that would make the tomb one of the most dangerous places on Earth to enter. The historian wrote that the tomb was filled with traps, automatic crossbows set to fire at anyone who entered, designed to protect the emperor's rest for all time. He described how the workers who knew the tomb's secrets and the location of the treasures were sealed inside when the tomb was closed, ensuring their silence forever. He mentioned that the entrance passages were filled with stone and concealed, making the tomb virtually impossible to locate or enter. Most ominously, Sima Qian wrote about the rivers of mercury that filled the tomb chamber. At the time, many scholars dismissed this as poetic exaggeration or myth. Mercury was valuable in ancient China, used in various rituals and medicines, but the idea that enough mercury existed to create actual rivers seemed impossible. The tomb would need to contain more than 100 tons of mercury for Sima Qian's description to be literally true. Then, in the late 20th century, scientists conducting soil tests around the burial mound made a startling discovery. Mercury concentrations in the soil directly above the tomb were exponentially higher than in surrounding areas, not just slightly elevated, but astronomically high. The distribution pattern of the mercury matched the descriptions of rivers in Sima Qian's account, suggesting that vast quantities of liquid mercury did indeed exist somewhere beneath the mound, and that vapor was still seeping up through the earth after more than 2,000 years. This discovery transformed the tomb from a historical curiosity into a genuine hazard. Mercury vapor is highly toxic, capable of causing severe neurological damage, respiratory failure, and death. If the tomb were opened and the mercury was still present in liquid form, the release of concentrated mercury vapor could be catastrophic, not just for the excavation team, but potentially for the surrounding area. But the mercury wasn't the only reason the tomb remained sealed. There was something else, something that couldn't be measured by scientific instruments or explained by rational analysis. There was fear. The local people had always known about the tomb. Farmers had ploughed fields around its base for generations. During various periods of unrest and rebellion, when imperial tombs across China were being systematically looted, the tomb of the first emperor remained untouched. Even during the Cultural Revolution, when Red Guards were destroying historical sites across China, vandalizing temples and desecrating graves in their fervour to erase the past, they left the tomb of Emperor Qin alone. When archaeologists began interviewing elderly residents of the area after the discovery of the terracotta warriors, they heard the same stories repeated across different families and villages. The tomb was cursed. Anyone who disturbed it would die. Not in some distant, abstract way, but quickly, violently, and with certainty. These weren't vague superstitions passed down through countless generations until their origins were forgotten. These were specific warnings, carefully maintained and deliberately taught to each new generation. Old men spoke of their grandfathers, warning them never to dig too deeply near the mound, never to explore the caves and depressions that occasionally appeared around its base, never to take even a small artifact if one should appear on the surface after a heavy rain or erosion. There were stories, too, cautionary tales about those who had ignored the warnings. A treasure hunter during the Ming Dynasty, some 400 years after the tomb was sealed, who had tried to tunnel into the mound. He and his entire crew were found dead at the tunnel entrance, their bodies showing no signs of violence, but their faces frozen in expressions of absolute terror. A group of soldiers during the warlord period of the 1920s who had attempted to blast their way into the tomb using dynamite, seeking treasure to fund their army. The explosion never happened. Instead, all 16 men were found unconscious near the mound, and every one of them died within 3 days, raving about guardian spirits and ancient curses before finally succumbing. More recently, there were quieter stories whispered among the archaeological community. Team members who had worked on excavating the terracotta warrior pits, safely distant from the tomb itself, but who had ventured too close to the main mound out of curiosity. 3 researchers over the years had died in unusual accidents shortly after such visits. A car crash that investigators could never adequately explain. A sudden heart attack in a man with no history of heart disease. A fall from a height that should not have been fatal, but somehow was. Coincidence, certainly. Statistically inevitable when thousands of people worked on and around the site over decades. And yet the stories persisted. And even hardened scientists found themselves reluctant to press too hard for excavation of the main tomb. The Chinese government maintained that the tomb remained sealed for practical reasons. The technology to safely excavate and preserve the tomb's contents did not yet exist. The mercury contamination posed genuine risks. Opening the tomb prematurely could destroy priceless artifacts through exposure to air and light, just as had happened with other archaeological sites that were excavated before preservation techniques were adequately developed. Better to wait, to plan, to develop the proper methods than to rush in and destroy irreplaceable evidence of China's history. All of this was true. All of it was rational, sensible, scientifically sound, and yet those who looked closely could see that there was something else, something unspoken in the government's repeated decisions to postpone excavation indefinitely, despite the availability of funding, despite international interest, despite the potential for discoveries that could revolutionize understanding of ancient Chinese civilization. The archaeologists who dedicated their careers to studying the tomb complex understood the official reasons, but they also understood something else. They had felt it themselves when they stood before the sealed mound, looking up at the artificial mountain that contained the first emperor. There was a presence there, something that defied rational explanation, but was no less real for its inexplicability. Dr. Wei Lin had been one of the first archaeologists to study the terracotta warriors after their discovery. She had spent 40 years of her life working on the site, had supervised the excavation of 3 of the warrior pits, had published dozens of papers on what they revealed about Qin military organization, artistic techniques, and technological capabilities. She had been interviewed hundreds of times by journalists, documentary makers, and academics from around the world, and every single time they asked her the same question: when will you excavate the tomb itself? Now 82 years old, Dr. Wei sat in her small apartment in Xi'an, surrounded by books and artifacts, photographs and memories. She had finally agreed to speak honestly about why the tomb remained sealed, though she knew many would dismiss her words as the rambling of an old woman whose scientific rigor had been eroded by age and superstition. I went into the first warrior pit when I was 38 years old, she began, her voice still strong despite her years. I was young, ambitious, completely devoted to scientific archaeology. I thought the stories about curses and guardian spirits were folklore, nothing more. Interesting from an anthropological perspective, but not something to be taken seriously by trained scientists. She paused, looking at the window toward where the tomb mound rose in the distance, visible even from her apartment several kilometers away. The first time I approached the actual tomb, not the warrior pits, but the central mound itself, I was 41. It was 1983, and we were conducting a survey, taking measurements, planning potential excavation strategies. We never intended to dig that day, just to study the exterior, to understand the structure better. I climbed about halfway up the mound with 2 colleagues. It was early morning, the sun just rising, the air cool and clear, and as we climbed, I began to feel something. Not fear exactly, but a sense of being watched, of being evaluated, of being judged as to whether we were worthy to proceed. I told myself it was just the psychological weight of standing on top of such an important historical site, the knowledge of what lay beneath our feet. But then my colleague Dr. Zhang, a man who had never shown the slightest interest in anything supernatural, who mocked fortune tellers and refused to observe traditional customs, he stopped climbing, just stopped mid-step and stood completely still. After perhaps 30 seconds, he turned around and walked back down without saying a word. When we caught up with him at the base of the mound, he said he wouldn't climb it again. He never did. He continued working on the warrior pits for another 20 years, but he never set foot on the main mound again, and he never explained why. Dr. Wei's story was not unique. Over the decades, numerous researchers had reported similar experiences, a sense of overwhelming dread when approaching the tomb, dreams of ancient armies and underground palaces, feelings of being actively discouraged from proceeding. Some dismissed these accounts as suggestion and psychology. People had heard the legends, so they interpreted normal nervousness as something supernatural. But the consistency of the reports, especially from scientists who had no previous belief in such phenomena, suggested something more. Perhaps the explanation was simpler than curses or guardian spirits. Perhaps Qin Shi Huang, in his obsessive quest for eternal power, had built something genuinely dangerous. The mercury was real, proven by scientific testing. If the tomb was opened and the seals were broken, mercury vapor could flood out in concentrations that would be lethal. The automatic crossbows described by Sima Qian might still be functional. Similar mechanisms from the Qin period had been found in other sites, their bronze components still operational after thousands of years in the right conditions. The tomb might be structurally unstable, supported by wooden beams that had degraded over millennia, ready to collapse at the slightest disturbance. Or perhaps there was something else inside, something that the first emperor had left behind intentionally. Qin Shi Huang had been desperate for immortality, had surrounded himself with mystics and alchemists, had believed deeply in forces that transcended the physical world. What if, in his final preparations, he had done something to ensure that his rest would never be disturbed? Not merely physical traps, but something else, some ritual or curse or working of forces that the modern world had dismissed, but which the ancient world had understood. The archaeological evidence suggested that something extraordinary had happened when the tomb was finally sealed. Historical records indicated that the second emperor, Qin Shi Huang's son, who succeeded him, had ordered the tomb sealed and the access passages filled in immediately after the first emperor's death in 210 BC. The records also stated that all the craftsmen and workers who had knowledge of the tomb's interior layout were killed or sealed inside to maintain secrecy. But there was another detail, mentioned only in a few fragmentary sources, that most scholars overlooked. The records indicated that several of the alchemists and mystics who had served the first emperor volunteered to be sealed inside the tomb with him. Not as human sacrifices, those were common enough in ancient China, but as willing participants in some working or ritual that required their presence. What were they doing in there? What final service were they performing for their emperor? The tomb remained sealed, and with each passing year, the reasons to leave it that way seemed to multiply. The technology to safely excavate it would always be not quite ready. The potential risks would always outweigh the potential benefits. The ethical questions would always remain unresolved. Did anyone have the right to disturb a burial site so deliberately and carefully prepared, regardless of its historical significance? And beneath all the rational justifications, there remained that unspoken awareness, that sense that some places were meant to remain undisturbed, that some secrets were meant to stay buried, and that the first emperor of China, in his obsessive preparations for death and his desperate quest for eternal power, had succeeded in creating something that would outlast not just his dynasty, not just his civilization, but potentially any civilization that might come after. The terracotta warriors stood in their pits, facing east, eternally vigilant. Tourists walked among them now, marveling at their craftsmanship, taking photographs, purchasing souvenirs. But beyond the warriors, past the outer rings of defense, the tomb itself remained as it had been for more than 2,000 years, sealed, silent, and utterly impenetrable. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the tourists had gone and the site was still, the guards reported hearing sounds from the direction of the tomb. Not loud sounds, nothing dramatic or frightening, just a low humming, like machinery running deep underground, like the circulation of the ancient rivers, like the breathing of something vast and patient that was willing to wait as long as necessary. The guards would listen for a moment, then return to their rounds, and the sound would fade back into the silence of centuries. The first emperor rested in his sealed tomb, surrounded by his rivers of mercury and his guardian spirits, protected by his traps and his curses, secure in the darkness of his underground palace, waiting for an eternity that might already be passing, ruling over a realm of death with the same absolute authority he had once commanded over the living. And above him, the world turned and changed and forgot, until all that remained was the mound and the warriors, and the unshakable certainty that some doors, once closed, should never be opened again.